If you're thinking about buying a new SUV in 2026, there's something you should know before you even look at the price of the new Hyundai Tucson. Because this may look like the same Tucson you already know. But some of the changes could make you see this SUV very differently. And here's the uncomfortable part. You may have already made up your mind about Hyundai. Maybe you believe Toyota is the safer choice. Maybe you think Honda is always the more reliable choice. Or maybe you still think Hyundai is mainly about giving you more features for less money. But what if that old belief is starting to change? Because the 2026 Tucson gives you a few reasons to take another look. And there's one change in particular that could matter far more than its new design. But that's not the only thing you need to know. Because before you decide whether this Tucson is worth your money, there's another question you need to ask. What did Hyundai improve, and what did they leave alone? And near the end, I'll tell you which type of buyer should seriously consider the 2026 Tucson, and which buyer may be better off looking somewhere else. So before you make up your mind about the Tucson, let's start with the change Hyundai hopes you'll notice first. The first thing Hyundai wants you to notice is the way the Tucson looks. At first glance, it may seem familiar. But look a little closer, and the Tucson has a stronger, more confident appearance. The front looks more modern. The lighting gives it a fresh identity. And the overall design feels like Hyundai is trying to make sure the Tucson doesn't simply blend into a parking lot full of SUVs. But here's the important part. Hyundai didn't completely reinvent the Tucson. And that may actually be a smart decision. The Tucson was already popular because it offered something many families wanted, a comfortable SUV that was practical without being enormous. So instead of changing everything, Hyundai focused on making the experience feel newer and more appealing. And that brings us to something many buyers overlook. A car can look completely different in a showroom. But what matters is how it feels after you've owned it for 6 months. Can you get in and feel comfortable? Can your family fit without feeling cramped? Can you use the things you need without constantly searching for them? Can you live with it every day without getting frustrated? That's where the Tucson really needs to prove itself. Because a new design may get your attention. But the interior is what you'll actually live with. And this is where the 2026 Tucson starts to become much more interesting. Now step inside the Tucson, because this is where the design starts to matter less and the ownership experience starts to matter more. The first thing you'll notice is that the cabin feels clean and modern. But more importantly, it feels like Hyundai wants you to understand it without spending hours figuring everything out. Think about your normal day. You get in. You connect your phone. You start your music. You check the navigation. You adjust the temperature. And you drive. That's it. You shouldn't need to fight with a car just to do basic things. The screens and controls are there to make those everyday moments easier, not more complicated. And then there are the things you don't really notice until you own a vehicle. Where do you put your phone? Where do you put your shopping bags? Can the people in the back sit comfortably? Is there enough room when you load the vehicle for a family trip? These may sound like small questions, but they're the questions that become important after the excitement of buying a new car disappears. And that's one of the Tucson's biggest strengths. It isn't trying to make every moment behind the wheel feel dramatic. It's trying to make everyday driving feel easy. The technology follows the same idea. You get the features people actually expect from a modern SUV, but the important question isn't how many features are on the list. It's whether you'll actually use them. Because a feature that looks impressive in a showroom means very little if it becomes frustrating the moment you start driving. And that leads to a much bigger question. Has Hyundai made the Tucson easier to live with, or simply added more things to impress you? There's only one way to find out. We need to look at what happens when you actually start driving it. So what happens when you actually start driving the Tucson? For most buyers, this is where the excitement meets reality. You don't need an SUV that feels like a race car. You need one that feels comfortable when you're driving to work, sitting in traffic, running errands, or taking the family on a longer trip. And that's where the Tucson makes a lot of sense. It feels more focused on comfort and ease than trying to impress you with speed. The steering feels easy to live with, the ride is designed around everyday comfort, and the overall experience is the kind of thing you can quickly get used to. And honestly, that's a good thing. Because when you're driving every day, you don't want the vehicle demanding your attention. You want to get in, drive, and arrive without feeling worn out. Safety is another important part of that experience. Modern driver assistance features can help watch what's happening around you, warn you when something may be wrong, and provide extra help when traffic gets complicated. You still have to pay attention. You are still the driver. But having that extra support can make everyday driving feel more reassuring. Then there's the hybrid question. And this is where buyers need to think about their own driving habits. If you spend a lot of time in traffic or drive around town every day, using less fuel can become important. But if you don't drive very much, paying extra for a hybrid may not make as much sense. So don't simply ask, "Is the hybrid better?" Ask, "Is the hybrid better for me?" That's the bigger question. Because the right Tucson isn't necessarily the most powerful or most expensive one. It's the version that fits the way you actually drive. And now we come to the part that can change the entire buying decision. How much does it cost, and which version is actually worth your money? Now we get to the question that can change everything. How much should you actually spend on a Tucson? Because it's very easy to walk into a dealership wanting one version and leave thinking you need the more expensive one. The base model may give you everything you really need. But then you see the next version. A few more features. A little more comfort. A few things that look tempting. And suddenly you're thinking, for just a little more, why not? That's how a reasonable budget can slowly become a much bigger purchase. So instead of asking which Tucson has the most features, ask a simpler question. Which features will I actually use? If you're mainly commuting, shopping, carrying the family, and taking occasional trips, you may not need the most expensive version. And if you're considering the hybrid, think about how much you drive and how long you plan to keep the vehicle. Paying more only makes sense if you're actually going to benefit from what you're paying for. This is also where the Tucson's competition becomes important. Because Toyota, Honda, and Kia all have SUVs competing for the same buyer. And once you put them side by side, the question changes from, is the Tucson good? To, is the Tucson better for me? And that's where the real comparison begins. Because every one of these SUVs has something it does well. The key is figuring out which one gives you the things you care about most. And there may be a very good reason to choose the Tucson over the familiar names. But there are also reasons why some buyers may still prefer the competition. So let's put the Tucson to the real test. Now let's put the Tucson next to the SUVs most buyers already know. Toyota, Honda, Kia. These aren't just names on a list. They come with years of reputation behind them. For many buyers, Toyota feels like the safe choice. Honda feels like the familiar choice. And Kia often attracts people looking for strong value. So why would you choose a Tucson? The answer isn't that it destroys all three. It doesn't need to. The Tucson's appeal is that it brings several things together. A comfortable interior. A modern look. Useful technology. Family-friendly space. And different choices depending on how you drive. That's important because there isn't one perfect SUV for everyone. If fuel savings are your biggest concern, you may look closely at the hybrid choices. If you care most about a familiar brand reputation, Toyota or Honda may still feel more comfortable. If getting the most equipment for your money is your priority, Kia deserves a look too. But if you want an SUV that combines comfort, technology, design, and everyday practicality in one package, the Tucson has a strong argument. And there's another reason not to dismiss it. Sometimes we choose a car because of the badge on the front before we even ask whether it fits our needs. That's a mistake. The better question is, which vehicle gives me what I actually need for the money I'm willing to spend? And when you look at the Tucson that way, it becomes much harder to ignore. But let's be completely fair. The Tucson isn't perfect. And before you spend your money, there are a few things you should think carefully about. Because the best buying decision isn't about knowing only what's good. It's about knowing what you might have to compromise on. So, after everything we've seen, What does the Tucson actually do well? Let's start with the biggest positives. First, it's easy to live with. The design feels fresh, the interior is comfortable, and the technology gives you the things most people actually want from a modern SUV. It also gives buyers choices. You can keep things simple, or you can choose a hybrid if saving fuel is more important to you. And for families, the Tucson offers the kind of space and practicality that makes everyday trips easier. But now for the part that's just as important. The Tucson isn't perfect. If your biggest priority is having the strongest possible reputation behind a badge, you may still feel more comfortable with Toyota or Honda. If you're looking for an exciting, sporty driving experience, the Tucson may not be the SUV you're dreaming about. And if you're simply looking for the cheapest SUV you can buy, don't assume the Tucson automatically wins. There's also something else to remember. More features don't always mean more value. If you pay extra for things you rarely use, you're not really getting a better deal. You're just spending more money. So the smartest Tucson may not be the most expensive one. For many buyers, the best choice could be somewhere in the middle, a version that gives you the comfort, technology, space, and convenience you actually need without paying for everything else. And that brings us to the question that matters most. Not, is the 2026 Tucson a good SUV? But, is it the right SUV for you? Let's answer that next. So, who should actually consider buying the 2026 Tucson? If you want an SUV for normal life, work, shopping, family trips, and the occasional long journey, the Tucson makes a lot of sense. It's especially worth considering if you want something that feels modern without becoming complicated. If you care about easy-to-use technology, a comfortable cabin, practical space, and the option of a hybrid, the Tucson deserves a place on your shortlist. It's also a good option if you're tired of automatically choosing the same familiar brands and want to see what Hyundai can offer. But now let's turn that around. Who should think twice? If your number one priority is buying the most familiar brand, you may still prefer Toyota or Honda. If you want the most exciting driving experience, there are other SUVs that may suit you better. And if your only goal is spending as little as possible, you need to look carefully at the price before deciding. The point is simple. Don't buy the Tucson because it's popular. Don't reject it because it's a Hyundai. Look at your own needs. And that brings us to the final question. After everything we've seen, is the 2026 Hyundai Tucson actually worth your money? So, is the 2026 Hyundai Tucson actually worth your money? For the right buyer, yes. Not because it's perfect. And not because Hyundai suddenly makes every other SUV look outdated. It's because the Tucson gets many of the things that matter in everyday life right. It looks good. It's comfortable. It's practical. The technology is useful. And you have choices depending on how you drive and what you want to spend. But let's go back to the belief we challenged at the beginning. Maybe you thought Toyota was automatically the safer choice. Maybe Honda was the obvious answer. Or maybe you thought Hyundai was simply the brand that gives you more features for less money. The 2026 Tucson gives you a reason to question those assumptions. That doesn't mean Toyota or Honda are bad choices. It means the Tucson deserves to be part of the conversation. Because the best SUV isn't necessarily the one with the biggest reputation. It's the one that fits your budget, your family, your driving habits, and the way you actually live. So if you want a comfortable, practical SUV with a modern feel, the Tucson deserves a serious look. But if you want something very specific, maximum performance, the strongest brand reputation, or simply the lowest possible price, you may want to look elsewhere. And that's the real takeaway. The 2026 Hyundai Tucson isn't the perfect SUV for everyone. It's an SUV that tries to give the right buyer a little bit of everything without making everyday life complicated. And for a lot of people, that may be exactly what they're looking for. So before you make your final decision, don't ask, is the Tucson the best SUV? Ask the question that actually matters. Is the Tucson the best SUV for me? Because sometimes, the smartest choice isn't the vehicle everyone else is buying. It's the one that simply fits your life.